Welcome to Training 1, Module 3, Step 3, Independent Assessment. This training is intended for users of the assurance process, including copper producer practitioners and copper mark assessors. This module covers the first part of Step 3, Independent Assessment, the independent desk review of the self-assessment. Independent desk review of the self-assessment. The third step of the copper mark assurance process, the independent assessment, is divided in two parts. In the first part, the copper mark appoints an independent reviewer to review the copper producer's self-assessment and make a recommendation to inform the copper mark's decision on the scope of the independent site assessment, carried out in the second part of Step 3. The copper mark requires that all applicable criteria are independently assessed at the site level. It is important to note that the independent review is not a desk-based or remote assessment. It does not replace the independent site assessment, and the independent reviewer does not make a determination on whether or not the copper producer meets, partially meets, or does not meet the RRA criteria. In this process, the independent reviewer looks at the copper producer's self-assessment, supporting documentation, independent third-party assurance reports, and publicly available information. The independent review is an iterative process involving both the reviewer and the copper producer. The outcome is the independent review report, documenting the information used to inform the copper mark's decision on the scope of the independent site assessment. The independent review report is accessible only to the copper producer, the copper mark, and the assessor selected by the copper producer. The copper producer may choose to share the report more widely at the copper producer's discretion. The report helps the copper mark understand the context in which the copper producer site operates. It also provides background for the copper mark assessor to prepare for the assessment and prioritize assessment activities. The report may also help the copper producer identify areas for improvement in preparation for the independent site assessment. Activities of the independent review. The independent reviewer is a subject matter expert with extensive experience in assessments of large-scale mines, smelters, and refiners. The copper mark contracts the independent reviewer to ensure the quality and consistency of the review. The independent review consists of 3 activities, which are then assessed holistically to inform the reviewer's recommendation to the copper mark. The 3 activities are review for completeness, verify equivalence, and conduct desk-based due diligence. Let's look more closely at each activity. The independent reviewer first looks at the copper producer's responses to the risk readiness assessment and confirms that there is evidence of policies and procedures for each of the applicable criteria. The independent reviewer does not confirm the copper producer's rating, but rather determines if there is documentary evidence available for the assessor to do so. For example, when looking at criterion 8 on discrimination, the independent reviewer will confirm the availability of a policy document prohibiting discrimination. Later, the assessor will review that this policy meets the requirements of the RRA criterion and that it is implemented across the copper producer's operations. In this way, they will assess conformance during the independent site assessment. The independent reviewer will also check that the criteria identified as not applicable are in fact out of scope and that a reasonable justification is provided by the copper producer for this conclusion. If there is no evidence available in the RRA, the independent reviewer may engage with the copper producer to request further information. During the self-assessment, the copper producer indicates which criteria have already been assessed through an equivalent system. The independent reviewer verifies the equivalent certifications or externally assured management systems and associated evidence to determine eligibility for equivalency recognition. The independent reviewer will assess the evidence submitted to confirm that the assurance or certificate is in effect or valid at the time of the independent review. The assurance or certificate is no more than 24 months old, or plans for reassessment or recertification are underway and communicated to the copper mark. The assurance or certificate is valid for at least 12 additional months following the independent review, or plans for reassessment or recertification are underway and communicated to the copper mark. The assurance or certificate covers the same scope as the copper mark, including operations, locations, and materials. Corrective action plans are in place to close any nonconformances within the next 12 months. The copper mark requires the full report from the equivalent system, as well as the improvement plan for any open nonconformances or recommendations. Some certificates need to be supplemented with additional information. For example, when using ISO 14001 certificate for environmental management system, the copper producer must provide evidence that the certified management system covers all aspects covered by RRA criteria that may be considered equivalent. For example, water management may be covered through the ISO certificate if the management system includes this issue area. The copper producer must also submit the policy commitment and disclosure practices to demonstrate the issue area is included. When the conditions for recognition of equivalency are met, those criteria will not be included in the recommended scope of the independent site assessment. The due diligence activity consists of conducting research on the copper producer based on publicly available information using internet search engines to identify any issues of past performance or incidents related to the RRA criteria in the last 5 years. Sources are reviewed and information yielded is reviewed for relevance to the copper producer's site. Due diligence is performed in order to contribute to the overall understanding of a copper producer's operations and its responsiveness to potential issues raised by its stakeholders. The due diligence research and results are not an assessment of the copper producer's performance against the copper mark criteria. The results of the due diligence are exclusively reported in the independent review report, which is not shared publicly. The copper mark applies a detailed methodology to screen the publicly available information for its relevance and credibility. 6 parameters are applied to the search results to identify any information that warrants further engagement with the copper producer or that influences the planning or conduct of a site assessment. After passing through the screening, the independent reviewer searches for publicly available responses to any potential issues. The process ensures that the copper producer has an opportunity to respond to any potential issue that was considered relevant and credible as well. The independent reviewer and the copper producer engage throughout the process to ensure clarity and completeness and to address any gaps in the review. The independent reviewer may request additional information from the copper producer, for example, when there is no or incomplete evidence to support the self-assessment, more information is required to determine equivalency based on the recognition process, due diligence check yields potential issues that are considered relevant or credible, or information provided is unclear or inconsistent. The copper producer may respond in writing with supporting evidence and/or through a direct conversation with the independent reviewer. The copper producer also has an opportunity to comment and respond to the draft review report. The independent reviewer will make a recommendation for the scope of the independent site assessment. All criteria are in scope unless the independent review process confirms that the criterion is met through equivalency and there are no potential issues raised through due diligence for that criterion, partially met through equivalency, in which case only the gaps in equivalency are in scope, or not applicable. Independent review process. The copper mark assigns the independent reviewer within 48 hours of the copper producer submitting the completed self-assessment in the RRA platform. The independent reviewer will complete a first draft within 10 business days of the assignment. At this point, the copper producer will receive the draft as well as any questions and is able to provide a response within 5 business days. This process then repeats one more time until the final report is released within 1 month of the RRA submission. After receiving the final report, the copper mark has 10 business days to make a determination on the need and scope for the independent site assessment. The copper mark communicates its decision to the copper producer in writing. If no independent site assessment is required, the copper mark will be awarded at this point. As mentioned, the outcome of the independent review is a report accessible only to the copper producer, the copper mark, and the chosen copper mark assessor. The report contains a summary tab with a snapshot of the summary of each activity and the independent reviewer's recommendation. Each additional tab goes into greater detail on the information gathered and findings for each activity. The copper producer may use the independent review report to prepare for the site assessment. The copper producer can identify areas for improvement and implement associated corrective actions. This is also the time where the copper producer should contact and contract an improved assessor listed on the Copper Mark website. The copper producer should inform the Copper Mark of the appointed assessor and the timing of the assessment so we can share the independent review report. Copper Mark assessors are expected to use the report, the self-assessment, and all supporting documents to prepare for the site assessment. The report provides information to understand the context of the operations, develop an assessment agenda, and prioritize risks and questions for review on site. This brings us to the end of Module 3. Thank you for your participation.